Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you tuning in today, we welcome you in. You know, I honestly believe in the flood myth. It's too prevalent in ancient cultures for it not to have some sort of basis in reality. That may shock you, as while I am a man of faith, Silverlight doesn't usually profess to believe the wilder things. But I'm going to say to you, if you listen and read the stories, they do have a base to them. And yes, things got exaggerated because you always want to make your ancestors look good, but there is a pretty big kernel of truth in there. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. Now, in the Bible, the world is actually flooded from the very beginning. We're talking Genesis 1.1 creation story, not Genesis 1.2. Because God hovered above the waters and said, "Let there be light." Genesis 1.2. I am going off this with memory, even though I've got the Holy Scriptures over there. I don't need to look at them. And eventually he separates the water so that it may become land. Now, skip on later, and he tells Noah, yep, a disaster's coming. Take yourself 2 of every unclean animal, and I think it's 6 of every unclean. I might have the number wrong. It's been a while since I read that. But so basically you're going to have clean animals repopulating the earth and making sure you have enough food to eat. So that would imply cows, sheep, probably not pigs, but who knows? We're not from back then. And Noah does that. Now it's obviously quite impossible to pick up all animals and birds and crayfish, because crayfish would probably be swept away by a flood, and keep them in any sort of ark for any amount of time. Remember, we're talking 40 days and 40 nights. Now I'm going to say maybe it wasn't 40 days and 40 nights, but that sure does sound good when you're writing a story. Oh, it was 40 days and 40 nights. You also hear that a lot when you actually read the Bible. So maybe, just maybe, this myth takes off from about 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the Bosphorus Strait was still a wall and the Mediterranean was overflowing because the ice glaciers were melting. Humans would have probably known that the land barrier was getting smaller and smaller, and they do seem to be finding stuff at the bottom of the Black Sea that suggests that there was once a civilization living in a lush river valley down there. Suggests. So if that thing went, and that's not far away from the Middle East, thousands of people would have been displaced, all of which carrying their memories of somebody who escaped a flood. Now, 10,000 years ago to about 3,000 years ago is a long time, but we know myths can last for incredibly large periods of time. The Akkadians and Sumerians, who the Bible acknowledges as their spiritual ancestors, when Ur of the Chaldees is mentioned, Ur is a city in basically southern Iraq, and it was a Sumerian and Akkadian city. They tell Abraham, "Get thee out of thy homeland, out of thy city, and go to the place I will show you." Now, Ur of the Chaldees was basically saying, this is our capital in the Chaldees. This wasn't some insignificant part. This was a place where definitely princes would have been present, probably, ambassadors, travelers, traders, you name it. And Abraham is not a peasant shepherd moving from place to place. He has 80 armed cavalrymen sitting with him, ready with camels to go. When they kidnap Lot, he wages war and wins. He came from Ur of the Chaldees, a capital of sorts. And he had enough people around that he had his own private army. He probably was very well versed in their lore. And as we know from the telephone game, that lore does get warped from time to time. So the idea of a clean and unclean animal is probably a later addition. And whether they were referring to the flood in the Black Sea region, or whether they had their own flood myths, because the sea would have risen too, and there's perhaps some buried civilizations that are out in the Gulf which we haven't discovered yet. No matter what, somebody was escaping by boat, and they became very famous. Do you believe somebody trying to get away from a flood wouldn't use a boat and wouldn't bring whatever they could from their household? Yeah, the pigs might not be very useful, but the sheep and the chickens, I don't know if chickens were around back then. I know they're a relatively late addition. They came from the Chinese area, but we'll just assume sheep. They would be able to put a whole bunch on their, what do you want to call it, their ark, and get away. That is conceivable. That would be a story you'd pass on to your children's children. If you heard it from your neighbor, you might say, hey, that guy's a descendant of Noah. You know what Noah did? And it has the staying power to last forever, with cultural changes, of course. Now, I did say Sumeria and Acadia had their own flood myth. Yeah, it's not precisely the same, but it's close enough that you can see one and the other. We have, well, in North America, we have earth diver myths, which means the earth started off covered in water. And pick an animal, any animal, dove down to the bottom of the sea, brought back a clump of earth, and they formed the entire earth from that little clump. And that animal is deified or, given immortality or whatever. It changes from myth to myth. So there's this concept that our very being comes from the depths and that we are locked in with, floods and water and depths and our relationship with that aquatic force. And now we know we need to drink water. We know that water is very destructive, and it doesn't take a whole lot of water to ruin a house. To say nothing about the Mesopotamian Israelite connection, where they're having mud brick baked houses. It's exactly what it sounds like. Put some mud down, wait till the sun toasts it, they make their houses out of that. Well, a flood can do all sorts of damage to that. They're not very effective as retaining walls or anything, but they are very effective at keeping you cool for the technology of the time. So while we're never going to find the Ark, we're probably going to find a lot of these myths worldwide, because at the same time that the glaciers were melting, they were filling up the rivers. The rivers, after a certain point, any river is going to break its banks and start flooding onto the land. I'm fully willing to say we're never going to find the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant, possibly. The Ark of Noah, never. Because there's no way it was properly preserved. Even if it's at the base of a mountain in Turkey, possible, but the fact that nobody's even bothering with exploration there, tells you nobody thinks it's a good enough risk to even take a flyer on it. That's billionaires that like to sponsor scientists. That's universities who that would be a giant coup for them. Nobody wants to go for it. But as a myth, it points to something. Creation myths are the same way. In creation, well, we know we had to come from somewhere. From there, it gets a little more imaginative and reflects more about the people. But a flood myth, a flood is a specific concept. Um, there are floods going on constantly in the world, whether you're in a desert, whether you're in a wetland. It happens. It would be something familiar to the people, something they could very easily relate to. But the problem is, while they could relate to it, was something set so far in the past, even for them, not only did it get embellished, but it became something that they just expected was a reality. They'd be more surprised to find out that there wasn't a flood, and so would I. It doesn't need to be an earth covering flood, which there's not enough water in the world to do that. And also, what would trigger all that melting all at once, especially when we still have ice caps, like that, those would have to not be there. But the interesting thing is there's enough there's enough evidence that if I was in court, I'd be able to prove my case that something happened. Now, this doesn't meet academic standards, and academic standards, the rules of research and evidence are a lot more firm. But in a court of law, I'd be able to prove this. And I just went off one myth. I'm not going to go into the Popova or anything else I could pull down off this shelf of mine. But tell me, what do you think? If you give it enough time and enough mutations, a story about a flood would perpetrate worldwide. And the fact it's so common does show something did happen within our human race's memory that was worth keeping, worth noting, and worth keeping the children told about. And that's because it's a warning. Even though in our version, God says, I will never do that again, that is not universal. That's local flair. The real myth basically says, yeah, I did it. Deal with it. Or the gods are, trying to protect themselves in the middle of this cataclysm. Whatever it was, that's all local flavor. But the flood itself, yeah, multiple floods probably took place on a smaller scale than a planetary scale, but still significant enough so that the people were worried about it and wanting to remember it for all eternity. So with that, we hope you enjoyed this more philosophical episode of the Silverlight Show, something I prefer to talk about. If you did, please like, share, because sharing is caring, unless you're a flood, in which case, keep to yourself. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Don't forget to click the notification icon down below, and we hope you had a fantastic day.